Thanks, Sally. I hope I can live up to that. So I've been asked to say something about land ownership, and specifically about the relationship between land ownership and inclusive growth. So when we talk about land ownership in Scotland, we all know Scotland has a really concentrated pattern of land ownership. An awful lot of our land is owned by not very many people. And there's loads of statistics out there that show that. And, I don't need to rehash them here. You're all familiar with them. But not everybody agrees that matters. Not everybody thinks that land ownership is actually important. A lot of people think it's really important, and in fact that it's vital to understanding patterns of development, particularly in rural areas. But a lot of people think that land ownership is irrelevant, and that actually what matters is how land is used and how it's managed. So as Hamish mentioned earlier, we did some research on this, and we published it earlier this year. And one of the conclusions of that research was, quite conclusively, we found actually land ownership does matter. It is important. But I know not everybody's convinced by that. In fact, some people have been quite critical of the evidence we have produced. So I'm not going to stand here today. I'm not going to spend an awful lot of time talking about what we found and what our conclusions were. Because frankly, if you're not convinced already, me standing here repeating it all isn't going to change your mind. And by the way, if you haven't seen that research, it is all, of course, available on our website. So I will start by giving you a quick summary of what we found, but I'm not going to spend a long time on it, because what I really want to do is try to relate what we found back to a wider body of international research on land ownership, which I think provides a really quite compelling case about why land ownership is so important. And I'm going to try and do that just by presenting you with some facts, some pieces of information about the relationship between land ownership, inequality and economic growth, and let you make up your own mind. Let's hope this works. Grand. So before I start talking about other people's research and what other people have found, let me just spend a couple of minutes talking about what we found. The call for evidence that we published last year now, what we did is we went out and invited people who had experience of living or working in parts of the country where land ownership is very, very concentrated. We invited them to come forward and tell us about their experience. We just wanted to know how it affects their lives. And we asked them two very simple questions. We asked what they thought the advantages and disadvantages of Scotland's current pattern of land ownership are, and importantly, whether they had any experience of those advantages and disadvantages. Now, we got a great response to that. More than 400 people, 407 people responded to that call. Now, some people think that's a big number. Some people disagree with that. But actually, it's not about the numbers. What this is really about, it's about the common themes that emerged from within that evidence, the common stories that people were telling us, the things that kept being repeated again and again and again. And there was a lot of that. One of the most important findings, I think, from the report was that the disadvantages that we identified, they weren't related to the scale of landholding. It wasn't about scale. What it was about was the concentration of power, of social, economic and decision-making power that goes hand in hand with land ownership. So this really isn't about how much land any one individual owns. It's about a single individual or entity having the power to decide who can access land, when, for what purpose and for how much. And that's really not surprising. It's kind of obvious when you think about it, because land is so vital for so many things, so many aspects of development, particularly in rural areas. It's needed for housing development, it's needed for community facilities, for recreation, for growing food, and of course for business expansion. And when the power to make decisions about all of those things rests in the hands of one individual or one organisation, that power, and if that power isn't exercised responsibly, and we know in some cases it isn't, then that can have enormous adverse consequences for communities. So the type of effects, the type of adverse consequences we're really talking about here, most of it actually comes down, when you think about it, comes down to economic opportunities. Like more than 50% of the disadvantages people told us about were about local economic opportunities. This is what it's about. So sometimes that was about things that landowners had done. It was about physically constraining growth or the growth of communities or the growth of the economy in some way. But actually more often it was about what landowners hadn't done. It was about not taking advantage of opportunities that existed, about not realising potential. And that theme about realising potential and the importance of realising potential, that's something I'm going to come back to because it's really, really important. Another really strong common thread within the evidence is this theme of unfairness. An awful lot of people in Scotland think it's fundamentally unfair that so much of Scotland is owned by so few people. And an awful lot of people in Scotland think it's fundamentally unfair that so many people in rural Scotland find it so difficult to influence decisions about land that affect their lives. Now, it's really easy to dismiss that kind of narrative, to dismiss that as some kind of, talk about fairness as some kind of airy-fairy, left-wing, liberal, kind of touchy-feely nonsense. But, it's the politics of envy. But actually, it's so much more than that. There are very strong economic reasons for pursuing fairness as a policy objective, and very strong international research evidence that supports doing that. And that's really what I want to spend my time exploring today. Before I do that, I just want to make one quick point, and it's a quick point, but it's an important one. This isn't all about land ownership. Land ownership is not the only issue here. How land is used and managed is also really important, and that did come through quite clearly in the conclusions of our report. But I have been asked to talk about land ownership, so that is what I'm going to focus on. So, intuitively, I think the idea that too much inequality is a bad thing makes sense. I think people kind of get that, but actually it's taken quite a long time for that idea to gain traction. And I think that's because the relationship between inequality and economic growth, it's more complicated than you'd think. In the early stages of development, some inequality is actually a good thing. It's useful, it's helpful, because at an individual level, it encourages, it incentivizes individual effort. It encourages people to move to where the jobs are, that kind of thing. And at a societal level as well, the concentration of wealth in a small number of hands allows you to accumulate the physical capital, the factories, the railroads, and the industrial machinery that you need to drive growth. So in the early stages, actually, some inequality is useful, it's helpful. And up until about the mid-1980s, the received wisdom was that once societies had reached a certain level of development, inequality would naturally start to fall, and you get this kind of trickle-down effect. So hopefully you can see from that graph, actually that kind of did start to happen. And all the way from about the 1920s through to sort of the 60s and most of the way through the 70s, inequality was falling quite steadily. And then we got to 1979 and the world changed and it started shooting up. It went up and up and up and up and up. And we're not quite, but nearly back to the position we were at in or just after World War I, which is astonishing. So in the 80s and the 90s, that led economists to start questioning actually, question that received wisdom. And actually, instead of driving growth, is inequality now starting to constrain it? And they found very clear evidence that actually, yes, it is. And there's lots of theories about why that might be the case, but the dominant one today seems to be about human capital and accumulation of human capital. As I said, in the early days, or the start of development, growth tends to be driven by the accumulation of physical capital. In the later stages of development, growth is driven by the accumulation of human capital. And Steve alluded to this when he, in his talk, he talked a lot about human capital. And what I mean by human capital, well, it is often equated with education, but actually it's much more than that. And it's all the skills, the knowledge, the habits, and personality traits that each one of us has that we use to make a positive contribution, a valuable contribution to society and to the economy. So it's all of that stuff. And what happens when wealth is concentrated is it becomes really difficult for individuals to invest and to grow and to develop their human capital. And that's ultimately what impairs long-term growth. So if some inequality is a good thing, but too much is a bad thing, I guess the logical question from that is, well, where's the tipping point? When does enough become too much? And this is where it gets a little slightly technical. Inequality is usually measured by something called a Gini coefficient. And all you need to know about that is it's between 0 and 1. And if you had a situation where all wealth in the country was owned by one person, the coefficient would be 1. And if you had a situation of absolute equality where everybody owned exactly the same amount, the coefficient would be 0. So somewhere between 0 and 1. The UK at the moment is somewhere around about 0.35. The International Monetary Fund published research, I think a couple of years ago now, looking at where the tipping point was. And they found conclusive empirical evidence that the tipping point was about 2.7. So above a coefficient of 2.7, inequality actually constrains growth. So there's no question, we're beyond that tipping point now. We're beyond that point. And, that's widely accepted, I think, that the amount of inequality we have in the UK and much of the rest of the Western world is too much. It's constraining growth. But if you're not convinced, there was a big study done by the OECD in 2014, and it looked at data for 19 different countries around the world, and between 1985 and 2005. And what it found was the cumulative effect of rising inequality over that period had constrained growth to the tune of 8.5%. So growth was actually 8.5% lower than it otherwise would have been just because of rising inequality. And that's huge. That's really big. So there's no argument that inequality harms growth. But for our purposes, what about the role of land in all of that? Most studies about inequality so far, they tend to focus on inequality in income. And that's only because income tends to be easier to measure. But actually, most economists agree that what matters here, what's really important, is wealth. And when you look at the statistics, it's really quite stark. 10.2 trillion, that's the net worth of the UK today. 51% of that is in land. And that's land, by the way, that's not buildings, that doesn't include housing, that's just land. And that's 12 zeros, in case you're wondering. I had to look that up. Interestingly, and this is a wee bit of an aside, only about 11% of the tax came up earlier, and only about 11% of the tax we raise in the UK comes from land. So I don't want to go into that, it's a whole other issue, but the numbers there just don't add up to me. So if inequality harms growth and land is a major component of inequality, then to my mind at least, it stands to reason that land ownership has to be central to any discussion we have about growth. And actually, once again, the academic literature seems to bear this out. There was a big study published just last year, a meta-analysis, I love that word. All that means is it was an academic study that pulled together the results of lots of other different academic studies. And it's 22 quantitative studies looking at the effect of land inequality on economic growth. And it concluded completely conclusively that there is clear evidence, and that's statistically significant evidence, that land inequality does have a negative effect on economic growth. Now, most of that evidence, admittedly, did come from developing countries. But that's really not a surprise, because most of the research that's been done on this so far has focused on developing economies, so not a surprise. What was interesting for me, or particularly interesting, was that it also showed that the effects of land inequality only emerge in the very long term. And I think that's interesting for us, because concentrated land ownership, of course, is a really long-standing feature of the Scottish economy. Another really long-standing feature of the Scottish economy, and perhaps one we're not very comfortable about talking about, is that Scotland's rate of economic growth. It's not very good. In fact, Scotland is consistently ranked in the third quartile of OECD countries in terms of economic growth. So, that's not quite bottom of the league, but it's certainly third division. It's not great. Now, given the evidence I've presented this morning, I really don't think it's too much to suggest that those two things might be linked. So to summarise the argument so far, Scotland's economic performance is lower than it should be. We know that part of the reason for that is too much inequality and too much wealth being concentrated in too few hands. And we also know that land accounts for a huge proportion of Scotland's wealth. So if we want to improve economic performance, in my mind, we've got two options. Either we do something about our pattern of land ownership, so as more people own more of Scotland's land, or we do something about land values and we actually bring them down. And we're doing some interesting thinking at the moment about how you might achieve that, and either through the planning system or through the taxation system. That's a whole other presentation I'm not going to get into at the moment. The question for today is, could changing our pattern of land ownership help to improve economic performance and actually deliver inclusive growth? Now, my view is, if a more diverse pattern of land ownership could help us with that accumulation of human capital, could help us or help people to achieve their full potential, then absolutely, yes, it can. And I don't think you don't need to look very hard to find examples to illustrate this. The one I've picked on is from the West Harris Community Trust. It was formed in, I think, 2007 or 2008 to purchase 3 crofting estates in the West Harris. And it succeeded in purchasing the land, about 7,000 hectares worth, in 2010. And at that time, I think there was 119 people lived in the area. The population was declining. There was only 1 child in the community under 5, and the local school had shut. So it was, it was dire straits. Since then, the Trust has delivered a whole range of projects. They've built 3 community wind turbines, and you can see one of them up on the slide there. They've also delivered 3 sites for a community for affordable self-build, so bringing new people into the community, and they've delivered this I think kind of wonderful building and this community enterprise hub, which is Talanamara. It's got all sorts of stuff in it. It's an events venue. It's got business space in it. It's got facilities for tourism and all that kind of thing. And what they've actually managed to create 10 jobs. Now, that might not sound like very much. It's sitting in a room of 200 odd people, but in a community of 100 plus people, that's massive. And they've also managed to completely turn around their population problem. So they started with a population of 119, now they're up to about 150. The left-hand picture, by the way, that's from the opening of the Community Enterprise Centre. And the only reason I've really included it is because the guy in the background that you can see there, apparently that's Ben Fogel, and I'm only mentioning that just to prove to my colleagues that I do know who he is. Apparently he's not a mountain. So I'm only, the reason for describing all that, it's not actually, it's not because I'm some kind of evangelist for community ownership. That's not what this is about. What the trust has done is truly impressive, but the point I'm getting at here is it's not really about what they've done, it's about the opportunities they've created. And it's the opportunities, when we're talking about these projects, remember they've all been delivered by local people, and that's helped people to develop skills. It might be technical skills in things like engineering or project management or finance and accounting. It's soft skills, it's things like communication and teamwork, and it's personality attributes. This stuff's, it's really hard work. It needs real determination and resilience and the ability to improvise, and that's what this has brought to this community. And what I've just described there, that's human capital. So in case you're thinking it's all about rural Scotland, it absolutely isn't. I hope you can see that on the slide there. I picked this one. This is pictures of something called the Shettleston Growing Project. And I picked it because it's a great example of what we can achieve by bringing vacant and unloved spaces back into use. So it's picking up on some of what Steve was talking about earlier. And so clearly that's a before and after shot. The site used to be owned by the Shettleston Housing Association, and it had just lain derelict for years and years and years. There's no prospect of any kind of development. So local residents got together and created this, I think, this wonderful space with all these growing boxes so as local people could grow their own food. Today, the site's used regularly by over 100 people. The project itself provides training in growing food and also in cooking it, so healthy eating. And there's also a big community garden there, and it's regularly used for community events. So again, these achievements, impressive though they are, that's not what I'm really interested in. What I'm interested in is how that change in ownership has actually created opportunities for people. So it's opportunities to learn new skills. It's horticulture, it's cooking, it's healthy eating, it's all that stuff. And it's opportunities to improve their physical health by giving them access to freshly grown local produce. And maybe most importantly of all, is opportunities to improve emotional well-being by providing that space for social interaction. So all of those things, again, examples of human capital. Now, I've picked on 2 projects here, but I could equally have picked on, any one of a number of community-led projects from throughout Scotland. The point I'm making isn't specific to either one of them. It's a generic point. And the point is that by giving people that power, giving them the power to make decisions about the land that they live on, that power, which is an intrinsic part of land ownership, you make it possible for them to achieve their full potential. You can allow them to be the best version of themselves that they can be. Now, obviously, that's hugely beneficial for individuals, but the key point I'm trying to make here, actually it's really beneficial for society as well. Because if we're allowing people, individuals, to fulfil their full potential, what we're doing as a society is making the most of what's ultimately our most valuable resource, and that's our people. So that's why I think land ownership is important. And that's why I think land reform is going to be critical for delivering that inclusive growth that we keep talking about.